When we think of Mexico's revolutionary murals, we're transported to scenes of struggle and resilience. These grand works of art, painted on walls across Mexico, celebrate the people, brown, proud, defiant. Yet, when it comes to women, especially rural women, their depictions tell a different story. Rural women are often shown as background figures, bowed under the weight of fruit and flowers, grinding corn, or grieving in quiet submission. They are the necessary witnesses, supporters, and nurturers in a male driven narrative. Beautiful, perhaps, but passive. However, what if we told a different story? One where these women aren't just the background, but are active participants, shaping their families, communities, and even the nation. This is their story. Welcome back to Mon Carnet de Poche. This is Steven, your historian for the moment. Today, I will begin a new series called Women of the Mexican Countryside. And over the next few episodes, we'll be diving into the lives of these women, exploring their work, resilience, and creativity as they navigated the rapid changes of Mexican society from the 1800s into the 1900s. And this first episode is actually kind of an introduction, a glimpse into the groundbreaking research that has been uncovered, and as we go into their stories. For decades, scholars have explored the stories of urban women in Mexico, but rural women have remained largely invisible, spoken for rather than spoken about, per se. And yet, these women were anything but invisible. They were factory and field workers, migrants and merchants, mothers and artists. Their lives were deeply affected by Mexico's transformation from an agrarian republic to an industrialized nation. And they shaped those transitions too. So why haven't we heard their stories? The challenge actually lies in the historical records that are publicly accessible. Rural women wrote less, spoke less, and left fewer traces in archives dominated by male voices. But through the collaboration of historians, sociologists, and anthropologists, their stories are beginning to be uncovered. So in this series, I'll be exploring the questions that challenge long-held assumptions. What roles did rural women play in their households, communities, and regions? How did they adapt to the pressures of modernization and capitalism? And how did their resistance and resilience shape the broader story of Mexico? By the end of this little series, I hope you'll be able to see these women not just as witnesses to history, but as active participants in it. Their struggles, triumphs, and adaptations are part of Mexico's story, and they deserve to be remembered. So, let's begin this journey together. In this little next segment, we'll dive into the historical context, exploring how rural women's lives were shaped by Mexico's rapid transformations, occurring from the mid-1800s onward. Historical context: the overlooked stories of rural women. Alrighty. To understand the stories of rural women in Mexico, we first need to step back and look at the bigger picture. The Mexican countryside has always been a space of contrast, vibrant, resourceful, and resilient, yet deeply shaped by systems of inequality and change. By the mid-19th century, Mexico was in a transition. The country was moving from a agrarian republic to an industrialized nation-state, much like most of the world in those times. For rural families, this transformation was both an opportunity and a challenge. Land privatization, economic modernization, and political upheaval created new pressures on households, and women were often at the center of these changes. During the Porfiriato from 1876 to 1910, President Porfirio Diaz introduced sweeping changes to Mexico's economy. Railroads connected rural regions to markets, foreign capital flowed in, and vast areas of public and communal land were privatized. For rural women, this meant new opportunities, but also intensified the pressures upon them. Economic necessities forced many women to take on new roles. Some entered wage labor, others started small businesses, and many expanded their traditional roles in the household to ensure their family survival. As one historian noted, rural women ground corn and stoked fires, but they were also in charge of weaving clothes. They sold goods and supported entire families during periods of migration or crisis. However, let's not romanticize this struggle. While modernization opened many doors, it also deepened inequality. Rural women often faced the double burden of managing household labor while taking on poorly paid work in the fields or agricultural processing. Their contributions were undervalued, their labor seen as a complement to men's. For Indigenous women, these challenges were compounded by the systemic racism and exclusion, as land was consolidated into the hands of haciendados, or large landowners. Indigenous communities lost access to communal lands, pushing women into exploitative labor systems like we've discussed in other videos. A great example comes from the Eniquen haciendas of Yucatan, where Mayan women's unpaid labor was essential to the success of the industry. Rather unfortunate, and we'll actually go into that later on, but yeah. Anyways, the Mexican Revolution of 1910 marked a actually very critical turning point for rural women. It was both a moment of upheaval and opportunity. While men dominated the battlefields, women were essential as spies, smugglers, food providers, and even combatants in some cases. As one revolutionary woman famously said, quote, "In war, we fought to protect our homes and our children, but also to prove we had a right to fight," close quote. After the revolution, agrarian reforms aimed to redistribute land and stabilize rural communities, but the reforms often overlooked women's rights, granting land to male heads of households and sidelining women's contributions. Still, this era opened space for women's education and mobility, laying the groundwork for future generations. From the late 1940s onward, urbanization and industrialization transformed the countryside even further. Rural populations began to shrink as families moved to cities in search of work. For the women who stayed, this meant adapting to new roles, working in factories, managing farms, or running businesses to support their families. And this is actually something that we've been able to see firsthand in my family as we converse with my paternal grandmother and hear her story and her family's story. And this actually brings us to a very critical question, I feel, which is, how do we uncover these stories? The historical records often leave women out, especially rural women. Their voices are absent in almost every archive, which was dominated by the male perspective. However, I think we're lucky because through the collaboration of historians, anthropologists, and sociologists, these voices are finally being heard, and I feel we can actually help bring some of those voices out. In the next segment, I'm going to touch on how scholars have pieced together this history using innovative methods to uncover the contributions of rural women to Mexico's transformation. From oral histories to community studies, we'll see how these approaches help us understand the lives and legacies of women who shaped the countryside. Methodology. How do we uncover women's stories? Uncovering the history of rural women is like piecing together a puzzle, one where many pieces are missing, and the ones we do have are often fragmented or distorted by the perspective of the time. The voices of rural women, especially those from marginalized communities, are largely absent from the written historical record we now have. Why is this the case? Well, rural women didn't leave behind as many written records as men or urban women. They were often excluded from the realms of politics, war, commerce, and intellectual life back then. Spaces where historical documentation tends to be the strongest. Instead, their stories are hidden in the margins, in travelers' accounts, census data, judicial records, religious records, and community studies. And then there is the issue of perspective. Much of the historical record comes from male writers who often dismissed or ignored women's roles, or framed them as secondary. To truly uncover these stories, though, scholars have had to look beyond traditional archives and embrace new methods. One of the most powerful tools in the work is oral history. By speaking directly with rural women or their descendants, scholars have been able to capture stories that would otherwise be lost. These interviews bring to life the experiences of women who worked in fields, managed households, and resisted oppression. It's actually something that I personally try to do as much as I can whenever I go down to Mexico. Additionally, community studies have also been crucial. Researchers living and working in rural areas can observe daily life, traditions, and relationships that are hard to capture within written sources. These studies offer a window into the structures of rural households, the division of labor, and the way women navigated patriarchal systems. For example, the work of scholars like Lourdes Aricipe or Cynthia Hewitt de Alcantara revealed how women, specifically rural women, balanced the demands of reproduction and production. They highlighted the women's roles of harvesting crops, raising livestock, and even earning wages to support their families, all while maintaining their traditional household duties. Something extraordinary, at least I feel and I think. Historians have also played a critical role by re-examining old records with new questions in mind. Census data, land records, and even church documents have been revisited to uncover women's contributions to agriculture, property ownership, and community life. This interdisciplinary approach, combining history, sociology, and anthropology, has been rather transformative in the way we now see the bigger picture of these women. But even with these tools, challenges remain. Oral histories rely on memory, which can be selective or influenced by time. Archival sources often require interpretation to fill in gaps or challenge biases. However, despite these limitations, the work continues on, driven by the belief that these women's stories deserve to be told. This methodology is about more than uncovering facts. It's about reclaiming voices by combining oral histories, community studies, and archival research. Scholars are reconstructing the lives of rural women in all their complexity. Their work reminds us that history isn't just written by the powerful, it's lived by everyone. And in this next section, we'll dive into the key themes and concepts that will guide this series, from the impact of modernization to the evolution of gender roles. I'll touch on the questions that really help us ponder the role that rural women had in Mexico's history. Themes and concepts explored in the series. Now, as we piece together the lives of rural women from the 1800s to the 1900s, certain themes emerge, threads that connect their experiences across time and space. These themes help us understand how women navigated the challenging and changing world around them, and shape the history of Mexico in ways both subtle and rather profound. Let's start with the most visible theme, which is economic survival. For rural women, survival meant juggling multiple roles as workers, mothers, and community members. In addition to managing households, women labored in the fields. They harvested the crops, and in most cases, they also raised livestock. They wove clothing, made cheese, and sold goods at the market, often under grueling conditions. But here's the reality: their work was undervalued. Scholars have shown that women's labor was often seen as a complement to men's, essentially there and being critical but invisible. As capitalism expanded into rural areas, women's contribution became even more critical, yet their status remained the same. It was precarious at most. Now, the second theme here for this series is the intersection of gender and class. Patriarchy shaped much of rural life, but its impacts varied depending on a woman's social class, ethnicity, and marital status. Indigenous women, for example, faced unique challenges tied to systemic racism and the loss of communal lands under privatization. At the same time, there were opportunities. For some women, economic shifts allowed them to become property owners, traders, and in some cases even manage the family business. And many of the actual works that I'll be citing in the series reveal a fascinating tension. While patriarchy restricted women's mobility, it also created space where they could assert agency. The next theme I want to address here is the theme of resistance and resilience. Rural women didn't just accept their circumstances; they resisted them both individually and collectively. From the revolution of 1910 to other local movements against economic exploitation, women always found ways to challenge injustice. Take Angela Jimenez, a woman from Oaxaca who became a revolutionary soldier to avenge the abuses inflicted on her family, or the women of Buenavista, Morelos, who organized against political corruption to protect their families and communities. These stories remind us that resistance takes many forms. And actually, another theme we'll be exploring in this little series is the changing nature of gender roles. As rural households adapted to economic pressures, women's roles within the family and community began to shift. With the decline of agricultural self-sufficiency, women entered wage labor, often becoming the primary earners in their households in many cases. These shifts weren't just economic, they were cultural. And over time, women actually gained more control over their earnings, greater influence in the household choice making, and increased mobility. Scholars have actually noted that a decline in traditional power dynamics, like the dominance of mother-in-laws or over younger women, was massive. And we'll actually touch on that very topic later on. And finally, I want to explore and examine how these changes intersected with modernization and migration. As Mexico urbanized in the mid-20th century, rural women had to adapt to new realities. Some moved to cities for factory work, while others stayed behind managing farms or even starting small businesses to support their families. Through all of this, one thing becomes clear. Rural women weren't passive recipients of change. They were active participants, finding ways to adapt, resist, and thrive despite the constraints they faced. In this last section coming up, we'll actually dive a little bit more into the specific periods of history covered in this little series, from the Porfiriato to the Revolution and, beyond. I'll explore how rural women shaped and were shaped by Mexico's transformation. Conclusion: why this history matters. As we've seen today, the story of rural women in Mexico isn't just a footnote in history. It's a central part of understanding the country's transformation from an agrarian society to an industrialized nation. Yet, for so long, these women were overlooked or dismissed, their voices drowned out in the grand narrative of politics and revolution throughout Mexican history. However, by exploring these lives, we gain a richer, more complex understanding of Mexico's past. We see how women contributed not only to their families and communities, but also to the nation's economic and social development. But this history also challenges us to think critically about the present. Many of the issues faced by rural women in the past, whether it be economic inequality, undervalued labor, and systemic barriers, are still relevant today. So, how do these historical struggles resonate with the lives of women in modern Mexico and beyond, even here out in the U.S.? This series isn't just about uncovering the past, it's about learning from it, and that's really what I want y'all to take from this. The resilience of these women, their ability to adapt and resist in the face of systemic changes, offers lessons for all of us. Their stories remind us that history isn't just written by the powerful, it's shaped by those who often go unnoticed. So, as we go about this little series together, I invite you to keep these questions in mind. What does it mean to reclaim a voice in history? How can we honor the contributions of those who shaped our world in ways both big and small? And what lessons can we carry forward into our own lives? Well, thank you for joining me on this little introduction into the lives and legacies of rural women in Mexico. In our next episode, I'll be diving into the exploration of the origins of democratic patriarchy in Mexico, gender and popular resistance in the Puebla Highlands. And it'll be mostly a reflection on the work of Florencia Mayon, and I'm excited to touch on that. Thank you for watching till the end, and I hope you guys are able to enjoy this video. Anyways, thanks y'all. Have a great day. Bye.